I know that Richard wanted to debate tonight the general reliability of the Gospels, and I'm really sorry that he's chosen to pursue that tack despite our agreement that that wouldn't be the topic tonight. But let me just say a couple of words about this. In the first place, the vast majority of scholars do not think that the Gospels are of the genre of myth, but rather of historical biography. R.T. France, a New Testament scholar, writes, "At the level of their literary and historical character, we have good reason to treat the Gospels seriously as a source of information on the life and teaching of Jesus. Ancient historians have sometimes commented that the degree of skepticism with which New Testament scholars approach their sources is far greater than would be thought justified in any other branch of ancient history. Indeed, many ancient historians would count themselves fortunate to have 4 such responsible accounts written within a generation or two of the events. The decision as to how far a scholar is willing to accept the record that they offer is likely to be influenced more by his openness to a supernaturalist worldview than by strictly historical considerations. The majority of New Testament scholars today recognize that the Gospels are not of the genre of myth. They're of the genre of ancient biography. According to Craig Keener, a Gospel scholar, all 4 Gospels fit the general genre of ancient biography, the life of a prominent person. And these biographies have a historical interest. Keener says that the Gospels use recent traditions, and that those that can be checked are careful in their use of sources, suggests that the Gospels should be placed among the most reliable of ancient biographies. Just to take one example, the example of Barabbas, the acclamation of the people, acclamatio populi, played a significant role in Roman legal administration, and there are numerous examples of Roman magistrates who heeded a crowd's wishes. For example, in Egypt in AD 85, the Roman governor released an accused to the crowd, even though he deserved a scourging. And why couldn't someone in that time be named Barabbas? That would symbolize son of the father. There's nothing the matter with that as a Jewish name. So I don't think that you can impugn the evidence for the resurrection by a sort of general attack upon the Gospel's reliability. Most scholars think that the 4 facts that I outlined are part of the historical core of the Gospel, however you might want to judge other things in the Gospels. Now, before we look at those 4 facts, Richard did ask a general question. Why did Jesus appear only to the disciples and not to everyone? Well, the New Testament is clear that the purpose of the appearances was for commissioning the disciples for the task of world mission, not for convincing people in general that Jesus was risen from the dead. People who haven't yet heard the gospel won't be judged on the same basis as those who have. People will only be judged on the basis of the information that they have. Now, with that out of the way, let's look at those 4 facts on which I based my case tonight. First, the burial of Jesus. We saw that it was multiply attested, and that Joseph of Arimathea is the historical person who buried Jesus, and Richard had no response to either of these 2 lines of evidence. Secondly, I talked about the support for the empty tomb. First, the burial account supports the accuracy of the empty tomb story, no response from Richard. Secondly, I said the empty tomb story is multiply attested, both in Mark's pre-Markan Passion story and in independent sources. Here, Richard reiterated his point that the Passion story is constructed out of Old Testament motifs, and I think that's simply false. As Joel Green points out, studies of the use of the Old Testament at Qumran among apocalyptists and in post-biblical historiography indicate that biblical texts were adapted to fit events more readily than were events created to fit biblical texts. In other words, in light of the events that had happened, they would go to the Old Testament to look for proof texts for those events. They don't create the events out of the Old Testament texts. Moreover, the Passion narrative includes events for which no parallel exists in the Old Testament. For example, the anointing at Bethany, the sword incident at Jesus' arrest, Simon of Cyrene and his 2 sons, the tearing of the temple veil, and so forth. And finally, third, the Passion story did not use obvious motifs from the Old Testament. For example, despite Psalm 22 saying, "They have pierced my hands and feet," the Passion story doesn't say that Jesus was nailed to the cross. For all we know, he could have been tied with ropes. So they didn't use this Old Testament motif from Psalm 22 to create the Passion story. In any case, I also indicated that there are multiple early sources for the fact of the empty tomb. Matthew uses an independent source, as is evident from the non-Matthean vocabulary in his account, and the fact that he's responding to a pre-Matthean tradition about the empty tomb. John is recognized to be independent of the Synoptic Gospels. Luke and John have the story of Peter and John visiting the empty tomb, thus indicating an independent tradition of Mark. The sermons in Acts are independent of Mark. And Paul's tradition is pre-Pauline. That's the point that Richard doesn't seem to understand. It's irrelevant whether Paul learned things by revelation. What he quotes in 1 Corinthians 15 is a pre-Pauline tradition that goes back within the first few years or even months of the crucifixion. So we have this wealth of multiple independent early attestation in support of the fact of the empty tomb. I mentioned that it was also attested by women witnesses, and Richard didn't respond to that point. Then fourthly, I said it's simple and doesn't show signs of literary embellishment. Here Richard says, well, yes, it does. It shows the reversal of expectations motif in the Gospel of Mark. I'm sorry, that's simply not true. There is no such reversal of expectation motif in the Gospel of Mark. Rather, as Robert Gundry points out in his commentary on Mark, Mark's Gospel is dominated by things happening just as Jesus predicted. It is all about the fulfillment of expectations. The final words spoken at the empty tomb in the Gospel of Mark are, just as he told you. So Richard's examples, I think, are just fanciful. They're in his own imagination only. Mark is not about the reversal of expectations, but the fulfillment of expectations. Fifthly, I said that the earliest Jewish polemic presupposes the empty tomb. Richard says, well, Matthew's account of the guard is constructed from the story of Daniel in the lion's den. That's irrelevant. That's wholly beside the point. The point is that what motivated Matthew to either tell or make up his story was that Jews were saying that the disciples had stolen the body. That's what motivated Matthew. And therefore, we have evidence from the early adversaries of Christianity that, in fact, the tomb was empty. So I think we have very good grounds on all five of these lines of support for thinking that, in fact, the tomb of Jesus was found empty. I then argued that Richard's own attempt to undermine the empty tomb by appeal to Paul is ultimately vain because Paul himself believed in a transformation of the body in the tomb and therefore would believe in the empty tomb. Thirdly, we talked about the two lines of evidence in favor of the appearances, and Richard admits that these occurred. He merely tries to explain them away as hallucinations, and we'll deal with that in a moment. Finally, number four, the origin of the Christian faith. Again, we saw that what the disciples came to proclaim and believe was completely contrary to Jewish expectations, and therefore requires some sort of radical transformative experience to account for what happened to them. Now, given that those are the four facts that are accepted by the majority of New Testament scholars today for the reasons that I've laid out, the question then is, what is the best explanation of these facts? And here Richard talks about hallucinations occurring, perhaps theft of the body or some such thing. I want to suggest that none of these naturalistic explanations really stack up when they're assessed by the criteria that I mentioned in my first speech. Just look at them. First of all, explanatory scope. The apparent death theory, the theft theory, the wrong tomb theory only try to explain the empty tomb. The hallucination theory only tries to explain the appearances. No naturalistic theory can explain all four facts before us. And as Richard says in another context, the sign of a good theory is its ability to explain all the data by the same single thesis. So the resurrection hypothesis exceeds these naturalistic theories in explanatory scope. Secondly, explanatory power. No naturalistic theory does a good job of explaining the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. Theft and wrong tomb theories don't explain why the disciples would come to this outlandish and un-Jewish conclusion that God had raised Jesus from the dead. Hallucinations of the dead, however real, don't lead to belief that the person is alive. As N.T. Wright says, in the ancient world, visions of the dead were not taken as evidence that they were alive. They were taken as evidence that they were dead. And besides that, visions of the exalted Jesus would at most have led to the conclusion that he had been assumed into heaven, which is a different category in Jewish thought from resurrection from the dead. Thirdly, plausibility. The apparent death theory is utterly implausible medically and physically. The pious theft theory is anachronistic in attributing to Jesus' disciples the motive to either fake his assumption or resurrection. And the followers of no messianic movement through the first century before Jesus to the first century after Jesus ever did or claimed such a thing about their executed would-be Messiah. The wrong tomb or relocation theories are implausible because once the disciples began to preach Jesus' resurrection, the Jewish leadership would have been only too glad to point out the disciples' stupid error in going to the wrong place. The hallucination theory is implausible in trying to psychoanalyze past historical